All right, guys, welcome back. We are still looking at the Cold War, and we're going to get up to our first major conflict of the Cold War. This is where the Cold War is going to turn hot, in the sense that there's going to be open warfare, and it's called the Korean War. And the Korean War is often known as the Forgotten War. And the reason they call it the Forgotten War is this is a war that took place between World War II and Vietnam, two very well-known, very famous wars. And it's kind of overlooked, and it's a war that has a lot of lasting consequences we're going to look at, but it's a war that most Americans really, frankly, don't understand very well and didn't at the time either. It's a bit confusing. So we're just going to walk our way through what was the Korean War, why did it happen, what were the effects of it. And being that this is the Cold War, obviously something with communism and democracy and all that stuff has to be at conflict. It has to be at odds for there to be some sort of war in Korea. So let's get a little bit of background. And to understand the Korean War, we have to go back to early 20th century Korean history. And in the early 20th century, they had been basically taken over brutally by the Japanese. So it was a Japanese territory basically all the way up until the end of World War II. So we have to go back to World War II to understand the Korean War. And what happened is in the closing days of the war, this is Japan down here, okay, there's the Soviet Union up here, there's China. In the closing days of the war, American soldiers landed on the southern half of the Korean peninsula. All this is Korea. And then Soviet forces came down from the north. And the two sides met at what's called the 38th parallel. That means it's 38 degrees north latitude. And that became basically the dividing line between the communist world and the non-communist world. It's kind of similar to how there were two Germanys, for example. And what happens ultimately is two new countries are created. And then on the north side of that 38th parallel, we have a communist dictatorship under Kim Il-sung. This is going to get a lot of support, financially, militarily, politically, and so forth from the Soviet Union. This is an extension of the Soviet sphere, the Soviet empire that we see developing at the end of World War II and early days of the Cold War. Now, North Korea was and still is known as the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. It's not very democratic. The people themselves are oppressed, but it's got a name that sounds very positive. Now, Kim Il-sung, by the way, this is the grandfather of the current dictator of North Korea, Kim Jong-un. So there's definitely a family resemblance. If you've seen pictures of the current dictator, it looks much like this guy. Now, south of the 38th parallel, you have another system being set up. It's hard to call it a democracy, really. It was a republic, yes. But the most positive thing, really, from our perspective, it was anti-communist. It was led by a man named Syngman Rhee. He was not exactly a fan of democracy as we would know it. In fact, you could probably call it a dictatorship, pretty repressive, honestly. But in the Cold War, if you were against communism, that was good enough for us. So again, to just quickly summarize, north of the 38th parallel, you have basically a communist dictatorship called North Korea being established. South that line, you have a anti-communist republic being established we know as South Korea. Now, immediately after World War II, the United States is going to demobilize. And what that means is we're going to take that gigantic military that we had, well over 10 million men under arms, and we're going to basically slash the size of our military drastically down. And the reason was we were done with World War II. We were done with war. We didn't want to fight a large war in the future. We didn't need a massive military. And so Stalin sees our demobilization as kind of like a sign that we were done with big wars and that we would not fight for Korea. So Stalin gives Kim Il-sung, the dictator of North Korea, the green light, the okay. And he gives them weapons, of course, and money as well to invade South Korea. And this is a Soviet-built tank back here with our North Korean crew. So we have Stalin basically being the aggressor. He doesn't think that the United States, or his Uncle Sam, is willing to fight and die over Korea. And frankly, he was probably right with most Americans. Most Americans couldn't find Korea on a map if they had to. They don't feel it necessary to go fight in a war they don't necessarily understand very much. But war it is. So let's jump into the actual details and then talk about how the United States responds. So the war officially begins on June 25th, 1950. North Koreans are going to sweep across that 38th parallel. I keep talking about this line right here. This is a very rapid assault, almost kind of blitzkrieg style, where the South Koreans are very unprepared for this attack. Their military is small, under-equipped. They're not ready for this. And the goal of this North Korean attack is to sweep southward and basically unify the entire peninsula under communism, make this one big Korean communist peninsula. Again, Stalin and North Koreans are basically gambling that we will not respond. Within just a couple of days, Seoul, the capital of South Korea, falls to the north, and the north is on a rapid march south. Again, Soviet-built tanks and airplanes and artillery and all that assisting the North Korean attack. So, why would the U.S. intervene to help South Korea? And the answer is, of course, something we talked about in the very beginning of this unit: containment. So Truman was committed to containment, this idea that you're basically going to restrict where communism exists. You're going to put kind of a line around it, a wall around it, and say, okay, it can't go beyond these boundaries. And so this is a big test. Will we, in fact, put American lives and money on the line to back up containment? Is it worth American sacrifice to defend South Korea? That was kind of the question, and Truman believes, yes, it is. Now, of course, this is post-World War II, and there's another international organization out there that you would expect that would step in and prevent these kind of attacks, or at least respond to this unprovoked attack. This sounds a lot like what was happening leading up to World War II, with countries being invaded by other countries. And so the organization I'm referring to, of course, is the United Nations, the UN. And the United Nations agrees, in fact, to send an international force of soldiers to stop the North Korean invasion. Now, by international force, I mean soldiers from a variety of countries that will go there to defeat the North Koreans. At least that's the goal. Ultimately, 15 nations will eventually send soldiers. The bulk of them come from the United States, but you also have British soldiers and other members of our European alliance over there as well. The overall commander of this UN effort will be General Douglas MacArthur. We saw this guy during World War II. He was the guy who had been instrumental in the island hopping campaign. He had been there in the Philippines when they were invaded by the Japanese. He was there to retake the Philippines from the Japanese. He was the man who oversaw the occupation of Japan after the war. So, pretty important guy, and well-known general, and he's going to be in charge of this overall UN command to defend South Korea. I'm going to go back to the picture. One more thing about this picture here. This is pretty historically important. The Korean War, which begins in 1950, is going to be the very first war America is going to fight with a desegregated military. Okay, so all these other wars before it, whether it was Civil War, World War I, Spanish-American War, World War II, all those other wars, they had been fought with a segregated military. Now, black and white soldiers are in the same unit. That's something unique to the Korean War up until this point. As I said, we got soldiers from around the world all going to South Korea with the goal of defending that republic from North Korean invasion. Now here we are looking at a picture of some American Marines carrying a wounded soldier off to be treated. And what's interesting about this picture is if they didn't say anything about Korea up here, this picture might be mistaken for a Vietnam War picture. It looks very similar because we're in the same part of the world, Southeast Asia. So by September of 1950, the North Koreans have rolled down the peninsula, and they've got pretty much the entire peninsula under the control, except for one area around the port city of Pusan. And this is referred to as the Pusan Perimeter or Pusan Pocket. The point is, it's kind of like the Alamo. It's the last stronghold, the last line of defense. If this falls, the entire peninsula falls, and it would be disastrous and embarrassing for America and the UN. So the UN and United States and South Korea, all of them have to fight bitterly to hold on to this area right here. Now, this is where General Douglas MacArthur does something pretty dramatic. He's thinking about the peninsula. He's thinking about North Koreans. He's thinking about how they're all focused this way, right? Their entire army is down here fighting. They've been fighting. They're tired. Their supply lines are stretched because they've attacked so far so quickly. And he decides, rather than counterattack here, maybe we should attack them somewhere else, somewhere they would not be expecting. And what he decides to do is launch a very bold amphibious assault on a port city called Incheon. You can see Incheon right here, not too far away from Seoul, which is the capital of South Korea. So MacArthur's soldiers are going to land here, which is going to catch the North Koreans who are down here attacking. That's going to catch them by surprise because they're now behind North Korean lines. So you've got North Koreans who are kind of trapped, basically, down here. You can see, again, amphibious assault. Think of like D-Day, for example. We talked about that during World War II. It's the same situation. You're attacking a beach, and you're landing your forces there, and there's MacArthur from a ship observing the progress. Now, the picture over here is a very famous picture of the landing at Incheon, and it shows American Marines getting off one of these landing craft, climbing up, and about to attack the North Koreans. And what's interesting about this picture, and this is real, I'm not making this up, this man right here, just moments after this picture was taken, an enemy grenade, North Korean grenade, fell among his soldiers that he was leading. And what he did is he basically smothered the grenade with his body, sacrificed himself for his soldiers. And that is him right here. And for this, he was posthumously, which means after death, awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. So this is the last picture taken of him just before he really gave the ultimate sacrifice for his men and for his country. Now, what happens is with us, I mean UN, landing soldiers here, and also we have soldiers here. They're going to launch a counterattack. We're going to attack southward. North Koreans find themselves trapped. Many of them start to panic, surrendering. Others are fleeing, trying to get past our army, trying to get up to North Korea to safety. Basically, the North Korean war effort begins to unravel very, very quickly. So they were on the very edge of victory, and now the whole thing is coming undone. Seoul, the capital city of South Korea, there's Seoul, is going to be recaptured pretty quickly. And then before you know it, we are chasing North Korean soldiers across the 38th parallel. We're now into North Korea, right? We're crossing that line into North Korea. So at this point, we're going to pause and think about what the original goal was in the Korean War. The original goal, of course, was containment, right? We're going to contain North Korean aggression because they're communists. And had we succeeded? Well, yeah, right? We had turned the North Korean invasion back. We're, in fact, invading North Korea at this point. Things are looking up. But at this point, we decided to go for more than just stopping North Korean invasion. It was decided that we're going to attack basically all the way north. We're going to capture the North Korean capital of Pyongyang, which we do. And at this point, we're kind of deciding to get rid of North Korea altogether, right? Just get rid of the regime, knock them out of the war, and be done with it. But every step we march further north, we get closer and closer to China. See, that's the Yalu River, which divides North Korea from China. And China, by this point in 1950, is communist. And we're going to talk about how they became a communist country in a later video, later notes. But they were by this point. And communist China feels really, really threatened by our presence. And they tell us, back off, right? Don't come any closer. But we keep pushing. MacArthur is confident that the North Koreans, or excuse me, the Chinese rather, will not get involved in this war, that the war is basically over. But it wasn't. The Chinese are in fact going to intervene in this war, and it's going to change the course of the war dramatically. That is going to be the subject of our next video. So to quickly review, we talked about what started the Korean War. That will be basically the fact that the Korean Peninsula was divided at the 38th parallel after World War II. North Korea was a communist dictatorship. South Korea was an anti-communist republic. North Korea invaded in 1950 after getting Stalin's approval. And the North Koreans almost succeed in uniting the peninsula under communism, but they're turned around after a tremendous invasion at Incheon under Douglas MacArthur. Then we pushed to the north, and now the Chinese are going to get involved, and that is what we're going to cover in the next video.